Oh, back with another absolute jogging nogger. Back with another, noggin breaker. Back with another, all right. So apparently there's an actual, there's actually an attempt to kill me. So I gotta like pay attention now. I'm not paying attention. I told you guys what's gonna happen. So, here's what goes on, right? So, it's argued that communication increases cooperation and distribution of matter as it occurs. That we gain the ability to talk as an evolution to prevent physical collision, meaning those things that we couldn't say in time that made us afraid of each other and made us panic and attack one another. Talking evolved in order for us to be able to state, no, I have no intention to hurt you here. No, I'm good there. I don't feel any kind of way. Well, here I'm kind of scared of you. I'm not gonna lie. That's what talking was for. It was to prevent collision of space. Now, here's what I suspect happened, and this is obviously I'm gonna be referencing the Christiana Crusades here. Give me 1 second. So, there was a group of people that had the desire to take as much as they could from the environment without meeting that intake with equal output, creating equilibrium change and establishing the frustration needed to continue justified matter. So, these people only spoke to take and justify reserving as much as possible. Now I can show you an example here of how this all works again. So as they consume the environment without creating an established trade that matches their consumption, the environment around them shrinks. And as it shrinks, life gets harder. Wars start. Nothing seems to go their way. Everything seems bad. Everything is bad. The world is getting worse, and that's just how it is. And that's only because they are not justifying the continuation of space. They are only absorbing and eating as much of it as they can. And so here's what happened during the Crusades, and here's what's trying to happen right now. As these guys were only taking in as much as they could without trying to give as much as they could, it established the opposite of communication. And we can assume that in communication, as you speak to actually increase distribution of matter as it occurs, that it pushes things outward and expands upon them in ways that allow for us to interact with them in new cooperative ways. But these takers were not communicating when they spoke. Every time they spoke, it was with the goal to take and justify keeping as much as possible. And so, instead of things expanding and becoming more, every time they spoke, they brought things to a point in which they could act physically or claim that there's an error of logic. And here's how that worked. So a person who is trying to take as much as possible is always trying to justify it. And so they have a collision trajectory, which is, obviously, equilibrium trade is somehow what establishes a fair spreading environment. But they don't want to do that. They want to keep taking as much as possible, and so they don't want for anything to make sense of why they need to change how much they're taking right now. So, as there is a collision trajectory, for the sole purpose of creating conflict to justify taking, every time you spoke, if you needed to communicate something and it took this long to communicate it, their collisive trajectory only gave you this much time to express it. And even if you somehow figured out how to express it within that amount of time, their continued trajectory of collision would only make it an even smaller gap that you had to express it within. Now, here's how all that works. Because you can only really ever get one segment to them at any time, anytime they said that this is what you said and you won the argument here, they would go to something that you didn't have time to say. And if you figured out how to beat the argument there, they would go to somewhere where you didn't have time to say it. And if you beat the argument there, they would just jump around and they would keep it going. And that was one of the disadvantages that were caused by them limiting their willingness to communicate if communication would not lead to them being able to take as much as they want and keep as much as they can. So, because they're not willing to listen, it creates spaces in which there was always a gap to take advantage of in which you communicated. Because you did not explain all of it to them, they weren't willing to listen. They can always say that there's something they still misunderstand because it was never said to them. It was never stated. And they can jump around these segments until they're eventually caught, or until they can justify, probably by reserving as much as possible, being bigger than everyone else or having more than everyone else, and saying, that's all life is. Talking is just fighting. That's what you said here. You said talking is just trying to take as much as possible. We just need to fight. And so de-evolutionizing us, taking away everything that allowed for us to get to this point. Now, once again, because real communication disproves the effectiveness of this taking as much as possible and reserving as much as possible behavior, they would like to claim that talking is pointless and never makes sense. Hold on. Seeing as every honest communicator could express so well how their strategy for survival was causing too many problems. So, their goal is to claim that talking doesn't make sense. They restrict how much they're willing to listen, and then because you can't fit everything that needs to be understood within the segment of their restriction, they move that segment around the spots that you have not been able to communicate until they're either caught and can't deny it, or they have enough reserve mass to start a fight and wipe out as much of us as possible. This is what I believe happened during the Crusades. This is what I believe has been happening during these kind of current silent passive crusades that have been going on. So, my solution for it, I have no idea. Probably just gonna let it happen and let these guys burn out. You know, the issue with these guys is that they pretty much, like, imagine this, right? Imagine, like, this is the shape of expansion. This is what they all look like when they're expanding and they're making more happen. This is what it looks like whenever they're losing, right? And they just get smaller and smaller. This is what they all do. They all collectively just start saying life is bad, life doesn't make sense, we don't want to talk about it doesn't make sense, you can't solve these problems, you can't solve these problems, you can't solve these problems, none of you can solve these problems, none of you can solve these problems, none of you can solve these problems, it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense, we don't care, we don't understand, we don't know better, we don't know, we don't care, we don't know, we don't know, we don't know. And then, once they've reduced the environment enough, they'll use that reserved energy they have to attack the environment at the loss advantage that they've created for themselves by restricting logical cooperation until it no longer had connectable progress. I said that a little bit wrong, but I think I got it enough here for it to be obvious what's happening. So, solution to this, understand what's happening and let these guys burn out, and then whenever they claim it's not fair, the world is a bad place, and that's what they do here. They don't apologize. They don't say our strategy was wrong, we get it. They say people are dying every day. They say people are dying every day. The streets are full of drugs. Women are getting raped everywhere. That's what they do. That's how they kill us. That's how they do it. And the whole time, their taking is what's causing the limitation of space that fuels all of those conflicts that they claim justifies them being allowed to take as much as possible. Okay, so let them burn out here. Eventually they'll reach a point in which they have to give in order to survive, but they'll just try begging and they'll try taking even harder to force us to give. So remember, the animals that are going to start coming up, the new ones that you won't recognize, the ones that are kind of similar to ones that you haven't seen before, that have differences you don't understand, if you aren't doing this, they're not for you. Do not get panicked. Do not get scared. And even if you do, trust them. Trust them. If all of a sudden you don't care about this thing that looks like it might be an animal and you start walking around, you're not afraid. Just keep going. That means you're doing it good. Just trust this, all right? I figured it out. It's all good.